was wearing a mask and preparing for a volunteer shift, helping protect homeless people from the spread of COVID-19 when a patrol car pulled up to his home. Surveillance video from Dr. Henderson's house shows him loading a van with supplies before the encounter. Dr. Henderson says the police officer handcuffed him after accusing him of littering.
I was in Paradise, California a few months ago. This is a community that suffered the deadliest wildfire in California's history, basically razed to the ground. 86 people died. 20,000 people became migrants, internally displaced people in the United States. And you know, these are not natural fires. They are burning so hot, they are leaving absolutely scorched earth behind. And so this is what 1 degree of warming, Celsius, looks like.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with a ping pong ball dropped on other balls in mousetraps crowded together. Now the same action, but with each mousetrap separated a bit from each other. You get the point. Physical separation is crucial. Now, of course, we need to get back to work, but not until there's enough masks and enough tests. Of course, the big money guys would rather we go back right away, in a hurry. Don't buy it. Physical separation, social solidarity. Speaking of the billionaire class, the stock market has had a great month so far this April. The stock market guys are sure that the government will take care of them no matter how many times they fail. Working people, not so good. Huge lines appear whenever there are free food or supplies. This is speeded up video from San Antonio, Texas. People in one of those lines. And this was just one of the lines in San Antonio, Texas. The New York Times had a photo of many of the lines. I counted 40 lines wide, maybe 15, 16 cars at least in each of the lines. Our economy works great for the billionaires, but in a crisis, it's a basket case. Look at this chart from April 17th. Look at the comparison between China and the U.S. Over 4,000 dead in China, but over 37,000 dead in the USA. What a comment about our system. The 50th anniversary of Earth Day is coming up, with online attempts at action all over the world. In Connecticut, there'll be 4 days of activity starting on Earth Day, April 22nd. The Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization will coordinate. The 22nd will see the New Haven Climate Movement lead an effort for a Green New Deal. On the 23rd, an expose of Connecticut insurance companies investing heavily in fossil fuels. On the 24th, Sunrise, Connecticut will lead an online climate strike. The final one will be on the 25th, a virtual rally with the emphasis on action. There'll be a number of very short remarks, singing by the state troubadour Nikita Waller, and various kinds of tweeting to try to pressure the powers that be to stop harmful gas plants and pipeline projects. And in this time of virus, to empty the ICE detention centers and to do something about freeing prisoners. Tweeting will be emphasized, so it's a good idea to prepare beforehand. See how to do it at pepeace.org. One of the people speaking at the virtual rally will be Barbara Fair, a longtime activist. She led a demonstration in front of the governor's mansion on Easter Sunday. Here's a portion of our phone interview. I had asked her what the situation was in Connecticut prisons.
Describe the situation now, because I read that Iran freed tens of thousands of prisoners because of the virus. So how about here in Connecticut?
It's been a total struggle for us, an uphill battle, because we're dealing with a governor who said from the very beginning there's no plan to release anybody, and he has dug in, and no matter what our pleas or letters or calls or protests, he stood firm. There's not going to be any release. So the only prisoners that you see get released are the ones who are already going to be released anyway because they were at the end of their sentence or they had been approved before the pandemic. So
Wow.
Some of the news reports you got in the beginning said Connecticut released so many prisoners, and the reality of it is that it's not because of in response to the virus. These were people that were going to get out anyway.
So it must be pretty difficult for prisoners to try to have any kind of physical separation.
Yeah, and that's what's so ridiculous. You talk about social distancing, which is the number one preventer of this virus. How do you social distance when you're in a cell with someone else, or in your dorm where there's hundreds of people just with beds close to each other? How do you social distance?
She finishes the interview bringing up the case of prisoner Carlos de Leon. He was in prison on a 2-year sentence for a weapons charge. He caught the coronavirus. As Fair put it, his 2-year sentence became his death sentence. I urge you to listen to the whole interview. Go to thestruggle.org. Racism doesn't take a vacation for the virus. See this Democracy Now! Report on the outrageous mistreatment of a Florida doctor.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic, New York City, but we're going to end today's show in Florida, where the Miami Police Department is under fire after a video surfaced of an officer handcuffing and detaining an African-American doctor outside his home on Friday. The man, Armen Henderson, was wearing a mask and preparing for a volunteer shift, helping protect homeless people from the spread of COVID-19 when a patrol car pulled up to his home. Surveillance video from Dr. Henderson's house shows him loading a van with supplies before the encounter. Dr. Henderson says the police officer handcuffed him after accusing him of littering and then asking for identification, which Henderson did not have on him. The officer was not wearing a mask. Dr. Henderson was. He had to yell to his wife inside their home to present identification before the officer finally released him. On Saturday, Miami Police Chief has ordered an internal investigation into the incident. The officer involved has not been identified. The encounter sparked widespread outrage and comes as African-American men report fears of increased racial profiling when they're following the CDC's suggestion that people wear masks in public. For more, we go to Miami to speak with Dr. Armen Henderson, an internal medicine physician, assistant professor of medicine at the University of Miami, also an organizer with Dream Defenders. He was recently profiled by the Miami Herald. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Dr. Henderson. Tell us in your own words what you were doing on Friday, and then what happened.
Yeah, so I was pretty much just putting tents in my car, and I was loading other supplies into my van, and while I was doing that, I noticed that the police officer rode down the street, that a cross-section of my block, one way, really slow, and then he came back around the street the other way and basically turned down my block. And he pulled up next to me, questioning me if I lived there, if I worked here. I told him that I lived there. I told him what I was doing. I told him that, where I was putting the boxes was where the city of Miami comes to pick up our trash every week. For example, they're here this week, and people on my block are putting trash in the same place that I put the boxes, on Friday. And he just, at some point, he just didn't believe what I was saying, or he thought that I was being disrespectful, and decided to get out of the car and escalate the situation. Once he got out of the car, go ahead.
Keep going.
Once he got out of the car, he asked me for ID, which I said I didn't have. And, I was trying my best to keep cool during the situation and, remain steadfast on what I was doing, which was to be, at downtown Miami delivering food and tents to homeless individuals that live downtown. And so I pretty much went ahead and continued to do what I was going to do, because I didn't know where this encounter was going. And then he just decided to put cuffs on me, basically. Once he put cuffs on me, I called for my wife. She came out and pretty much de-escalated the situation. But even before she came, he was like inches from my face, basically yelling that I should call him Sergeant, I should call him Sir. And with no mask on, he had no gloves on. I could feel his saliva on my lips. It was just a crazy encounter.
I mean, this is such a horrific situation. It reminded me so much of Professor Henry Louis Gates of Harvard, who was on his front porch when the police came and challenged him and arrested him, came into his house. So you're wearing a mask. The police officer is not wearing a mask or gloves, and he then handcuffs you. What ultimately led him to release you?
So, I mean, I pretty much, while he was in my face, I pretty much kept quiet, and I was just waiting for my wife to come, basically. Once she came outside, she basically, asked why, I was in handcuffs, and she said that we live here, and he said, well, I'm going to need to see some ID. Go get it for me. And so she went in the house, got her ID, showed him that we actually lived here, and at that point, he pretty much just let me go.
I mean, this is astounding. Are you satisfied with the police department's response? And then, Dr. Henderson, if you can talk about, I mean, this is why the Miami Herald had profiled you before. I mean, a number of people have done pieces on you. You have been working with the homeless, giving all kinds of mutual aid, and also have been testing them for COVID-19. If you can talk about your work and then what you want of the Miami Police Department.
Well, I mean, firstly, I want the officer held accountable. It's no way that you racially profile me and then you arrest me, you detain me, and then during a pandemic where you have no mask on, where hundreds of police officers throughout Miami-Dade County have tested positive, and you're up in my face, spitting on my lips when we're supposed to be practicing social distancing. He just broke a number of protocols. And violated my rights. So firstly, I want him held accountable, and I want an apology as well. But outside of that, I think the bigger picture is that I was going to serve homeless individuals throughout Miami-Dade County that basically, the city has said, and cities across the United States have said the same thing, where we have to shelter in place, we have to socially distance. And for someone who doesn't have a house, for someone who lives unsheltered, it's very impossible to do those things. And in a pandemic, these are the most vulnerable individuals. These are the individuals who we're supposed to be paying the most attention to, because these are the individuals that sleep on buses, on bus stops, on benches, and they, because of that, when you're talking about public health response to a pandemic, you have to focus on those individuals who are using the public spaces
and
the
can
most.
you talk about you testing them and the response of unhoused people to you testing them?
Right. So, it's been hard to get testing, if you're not a basketball player, if you're not a rich person. And so literally, we just been going out, and first of all, we did a survey of individuals to see what their symptoms are, and we identified people who needed to be tested. But then, because we are the epicenter of the epidemic, and this is the most vulnerable population, I just figured that we should be testing people at random as well, to sample population sizes to see how far, this virus has spread already. And honestly, though, this is supposed to be the city and the county's job in doing this, in providing necessities and testing individuals that are in this vulnerable population. And I think it just speaks to the fact that that I even have to do this. It shouldn't be my job to volunteer out there to make sure that homeless individuals are cared for, especially in a pandemic. So at the surface, it feels like a feel-good story, but it's really not.
Florida police officials say there will be an investigation. Now, more of climate activist Naomi Klein's talk at Harvard.
And yet the allure of ranking life in those rigid hierarchies continues to dominate our economic and social systems, and it may well prove our undoing. It seems noteworthy that the current president of the United States used to run a beauty pageant where he profited handsomely off the crude ranking of women's bodies. Meanwhile, the most powerful information company in human history began as a way for Mark Zuckerberg and his friends at Harvard to rank the hotness of their fellow classmates. It is also the logic of ranking life that more than anything else underlies the climate emergency. When the Watts steam engine was introduced in the late 1700s, which was the beginning, really, of the age of fossil fuels, it promised that by digging up lowly, insignificant black rocks out of the earth and burning them, industrialists would be free at last from the shackles of nature. And this is very interesting in terms of what the sales pitch of the commercial steam engine actually was to the industrialists of the day. Because actually water wheels were just as powerful, but they required that factory owners be in dialogue with the natural world. You were dependent on the river and its flow for your power. And similarly, when the steam engine was introduced to ships, the argument was you no longer have to be in dialogue with the wind. You can sail whenever you want. You don't have to wait for the wind to blow. And in the original marketing for the Watts steam engine, they literally said, you will be as gods, free at last. That hasn't worked out as expected, right? Because here we feeble humans are at the mercy of record-breaking storms and uncontrollable wildfires. This idea of liberation from the natural world, of no longer having to be in dialogue with it, hasn't worked out very well. It turns out that every action does have a reaction. Sometimes it comes at a couple of years delay, but all of that interred black rock, all of that interred carbon that has gone into the atmosphere has had a reaction, and it takes the form of weather that certainly demotes us in the great chain of being, in the same way that fossil fuels seem to promote us to the level of gods and liberation from the shackles of nature. If we are to emerge from this crisis, it will be because we remembered how to live in a web of life, not a ladder. That means connecting with what it means to be human, yes, and defending the equal rights of all other humans. But it will also mean learning to love and cherish the non-human inside of us, inside our very bodies, and all around us, not as our dominion or our possession, but as our salvation. We must be humanist, but we must also be more than that. We must stand with life and its right to defend and regenerate itself. In fact, I would go further and say that we actually need to be life defending itself. And so with that in mind, I will talk a little bit about fire, because it is very much on my mind these days. And I'm looking forward to the discussion, so I won't do a full fire speech, but I will say a few things about it, which is, when I called the book On Fire, I wasn't only referring to the fires of climate disruption. I think that we are living in a time of three fires, actually. One, obviously, the literal fires of climate disruption that comes from really upsetting the natural elements of the earth, digging up, in turn, it really comes from the misuse of fire, of digging up a whole lot of earth and putting it up in the sky and telling ourselves that that wouldn't have consequences that we would have to bear, that we had freed ourselves when we hadn't. And so we are now seeing really terrifying fires that are about annihilation. And we have seen, because these are not natural fires, the kinds of fires that we are seeing in Australia, with a plume of smoke that could be seen all the way from New Zealand. I have a friend in Australia who had a newborn in the midst of these fires. There's a generation of young people whose first breaths for weeks and months were this poisonous air. We don't know what the impacts of that are going to be. We do know that about 1 billion animals died in those fires. I was in Paradise, California a few months ago. This is a community that suffered the deadliest wildfire in California's history, basically razed to the ground. 86 people died. 20,000 people became migrants, internally displaced people in the United States. These are not natural fires. They are burning so hot, they are leaving absolutely scorched earth behind. And so this is what 1 degree of warming Celsius looks like. In October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that we really needed to do everything possible to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Not because that was safe, but because what is going on now is not safe. When we talk about dangerous warming or catastrophic warming, for people who are on the front lines of this crisis, whose island nations are disappearing, it is already catastrophic, right? So we have to be very aware of the sort of values and the biases that we're bringing to these definitions, often very technocratic definitions of what constitutes dangerous warming. For a long time, we were told 2 degrees Celsius was safe. And a lot of that had to do with calculations about whose lives were sacrificable and which countries didn't have big enough GDPs for us to worry about losing their economies, right? And this arbitrary target of 2 degrees Celsius was set. But now scientists are telling us, actually, we need to stop. And our best hope is keeping it below 1.5. In order to do that, we would need to cut global emissions in half before 2030. A decade from now. They said it is possible with existing technologies, but it would require, and this is a quote from the summary of the IPCC report, fundamental transformations of virtually every aspect of society, okay? In other words, a Green New Deal, but I'll come back to that. This is not, at the press conference releasing this report, somebody asked, can we do this with a carbon tax? They started laughing, okay? It's not to say that a carbon tax is not part of the transformation, but the idea that we can just have a technocratic solution that puts a price on carbon and then we can just relax, that idea maybe would have worked in 1995. It is not going to work now, not after so many decades of delay and procrastination and making the problem worse. You don't have global emissions in a decade with market mechanisms. You do it with a massive industrial project that is changing the way we live in cities, our energy systems, our transportation systems, our construction, our agriculture, right? So this is a different way of thinking, and it is really scary, right? The argument I made when I wrote This Changes Everything is, this doesn't just challenge a right-wing worldview that wants to deny the science. It also challenges a centrist worldview that wants to split the difference and not do anything really radical. But the fact is, we face a radical future. And this is very relevant to the kind of debates we're seeing in this presidential race, right? If we just stay on the road and keep our eyes shut and stick with business as usual, or just pretend we can do this with little tweaks, we face radical changes to our physical world. Radical changes that are actually, to quote Kevin Anderson, one of the leading emission reduction experts, it leads us to 4 degrees Celsius of warming, right? And that is with the emission reduction targets brought to Paris by the Obama administration and the Trudeau administration and all the governments that were supposedly doing something about this. That brings us to 4 degrees, which Kevin Anderson says is incompatible with anything you would describe as organized civilization, okay? So we have to choose between radical changes to our physical world and radical changes to our economic and political system. We may enjoy seeing ourselves as rational centrists who don't like radical change. That is not one of the options before us. That is what we need to wrap our heads around. And I think it's particularly important at a place like Harvard, where there are a lot of people who have built identities around that sort of serious centrist idea, because it's difficult to face. So those are the fires of climate disruption. I don't think it is a coincidence that at the same time that the reality of this crisis ceases to be something that we're talking about a generation into the future, or something we're worried about for our kids, but becomes a banging down the door crisis, that we are also seeing the rise of authoritarian figures around the world. Trump is one. Modi is another. Duterte is another. There are many of these figures around the world, and they share a playbook, they trade worst practices, they like each other, they have rallies together. I'm not saying they are the same, but there is a rise of supremacist logics around the world.
That's our program for today. Keep safe, folks, but keep active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.